And so I figured, so I wasn't the original person tasked with it, but we had a little bit of a scheduling change. And so the skipper gave me the pill and sent me to the mound and said, give this talk on data fairness and weave Globus in. So I figured I better go learn something about data fairness. And, I knew what the words were, right? I knew the acronym and I knew the words, but, did I really understand the concept? So I figured I'd go and I'd try to kind of distill what it all meant down first into single sentences. So when I looked up the fair data principles, there's all sorts of references out there. Just about everybody talks about data fairness and what it means to them. There's even a scholarly research article that I think was the genesis of the whole fair idea. So I kind of looked at those. I even asked Chat GPT about it and what it thought. And I've kind of distilled it down to these sentences. So when we talk about fair data, being findable means being well described, right? There's sufficient metadata there and a lasting way to identify it. To be accessible, it's got to be formatted in an open way. It needs to be readable by humans and readable by machines. And a lot of this is pretty obvious when you think about it. Interoperable data. Well, that's having a common, well-documented structure for data, metadata, and all the references. So it's usable in many different ways. And reusability, well, that's clear usage licenses for the data and a pedigree. I think the hardcore data folks call this provenance. They want to know where the data comes from, but really it's not only where it comes from, it's what makes it up. So I like the term pedigree. But as I sat back and I looked at those terms, I said, they're largely data-centric definitions, as well they should be. They're focused on the data itself. They really describe the what of the data. But Globus is a platform for dynamic data, right? We're not about data sitting still. We're about data moving and doing things for data. So I thought I needed to change some of those adjectives into verbs. So with apologies to the author of that initial scholarly article, I'm going to turn FAIR on its head a bit and speak to the how of FAIR data, and specifically the Globus how, because that's something I do know a little bit about. So what I did is I start to think, well, okay, I had my single sentences for FAIR data and FAIR data principles. So I need single sentences for FAIR data practices and processes as well. And so, how do you enable findability? Well, you provide methods for metadata ingest, indexing, the ability to search on those quickly. You can't just shove it in an index. You got to have a search component to that as well, and a way to create the lasting identifier so that data can exist in perpetuity. The accessibility component, how do you enable accessibility? And that's limit barriers to data. But there's a key here. You also need to provide an authentication and authorization mechanism. Accessibility doesn't mean just make it open for everybody. Make it open and accessible to those that have the right to see it. Interoperability, so the data management techniques that you use and the dissemination of data, those should fit as universally as possible into workflows, analysis, and storage. Everybody's got their own way of doing things, and you should be able to adapt to those. And as far as data reusability, well, that means curating your data from acquisition to publication to discovery, making sure there's a nice curation chain for that. So how does Globus enable data fairness? And apologies for mixing up the acronym letter order, but I'm going to start with enabling accessibility first. So, when I demonstrated Globus Connect Server, Globus Connect Personal this morning, and Lev showed Globus Connect Server, those are all freely available and downloadable. You can download those, install them, and use those to retrieve data. We even have the HTTPS data mechanism, right? So it really is enables that accessibility. There's a free use model for data transfer. I talked about that when I spoke to subscriptions. You can use these things freely if you're involved in not-for-profit research. Pretty easy to use interface, at least I think it is. The web browser's pretty easy to use. So, all things that we do as Globus to kind of enable that accessibility component. And of course, it's readily accessible by researchers. You saw logging in, right? You can use your GitHub, your Google identity, your Orchid, and there's 1,800 or so identity providers. So, you don't have to go get a special Globus account. You can use your existing identity to go ahead and log into Globus or authenticate to Globus, log in and use it. So let's talking a little bit about interoperability, right? And to that meant unified access to data using across all your different methods of storage by both human and machine. And I talked to that in the first presentation, right? We have those the Globus collections can be just about any type of storage out there because we have lots of different storage connectors. We've got lots of different ways to interact with the Globus services. We saw the web browser. There's a command line interface that's really slick and really slick and scriptable if you're an automation person. I love shell scripting the command line interface. We expose our API set. So anything, the Globus web browser and the command line interface all interact with the services using the API set that we expose. We got a really nifty Python SDK that wraps that. And then, of course, having a method for simple and secure data sharing. And data sharing can speak to you could speak to the accessibility component, but I really think the way the Globus guest collections work, it's really kind of an interoperability story, making that data universally available in the way that it does. So I wanted to speak to Globus sharing and some of the best practices for Globus sharing. But first, I want to talk a little bit about some of the common use cases for data sharing. And I talked to that a little bit in the first presentation. I know Lev spoke to that as well. But ad hoc sharing with a collaborator and being able to just work and interact with your collaborators, whether they're within your own institution or extra institutional. Data delivery to instrument facilities and users. Instrument facilities are there's a big Globus play there now. Instruments are huge data generators, and being able to get data from point A to point B and share it out reliably and securely. Big data sharing story for Globus. I mentioned sharing with your collaborators, right? That's multi-institutional or intra-institutional or with many different institutions, many people across institutions. And you saw how easy that was to do and set up, especially with Globus groups. And then sharing data sets through a portal. I'll talk a little bit about portals when we get to the end of this presentation, and I'll bring the portals in. And then, of course, it's a way to provision storage for users. There's a lot of people that's their preferred, a lot of RCCs, that's their preferred mechanism for interacting with their storage and transferring files is using Globus. And then data automation. Data sharing, we always say guest collections and data sharing, because of the way they auto-authenticate, is really the basis for data sharing. Very important to the data automation and important to the whole data automation story. Okay, so let's dive into a little bit of a data sharing overview, and we'll discuss some of the best practices. And I don't think I'm going to present anything really new here, especially with the overview. There's all things that I covered in the first presentation and Lev covered, but it's always worth a review. So you saw when you enable data sharing, you're allowing your users to create guest collections on top of a mapped collection. So I created that mapped collection. In fact, you saw what I did in that first demo. I created a mapped collection, or there was a mapped collection there. I put some data in there, and then I created my guest collection on top of that so you could access the data that I had put there. The guest collection, right? So it gives that user that ability to share it across that collection. You saw me do that. I shared with a group. I shared with individual users. I was able to give read and write access. So it really gave me the authority as the user to configure that. And this is important. All access to that data on the mapped collection or the guest collection above it is performed as a user who created the guest collection, which was me. So I created the guest collection on top of my mapped collection. When Lev transferred those files into my guest collection, his presentation. If I go and I look at the file system, it'll look like I wrote it in because it's mine. I'm the owner of the mapped collection. So anything that comes in or out of the guest collection on top of it looks like I'm the one that did it. So a user can add entries to that access control list to allow others to access some or all of that guest collection. And again, you saw in that demo, I let Lev have write access to the whole thing, but then I narrowed it down to the group that we had set up to access just the GW 2024 folder. And even now, if you go to that, you can only see that GW 2024 folder. I can also delegate to others administration of the guest collection or the management of the access control list. Again, you saw me do that, right? I delegated access to Lev to be a manager of my collection, so he could share it out with others. If I'm not there, if I'm doing this presentation and somebody's asking questions about getting data and something's wrong, Lev can go in and give them access. And then you saw me, I gave Gigi access to the group so she can really manage that access control list. Now, we don't need that group anymore because I made it available to all Globus users, but it gives you all those levers of control. Users can share guest collections with different types of permissions. Again, you saw me do that with Lev. I gave him read permissions. Other users read write to Lev, read permissions only to other users. And as a storage gateway user, and you saw in Lev's presentation, right? You, as the administrator, you can set up certain guardrails to this, right? You can determine what the user can and can't do. So the transfer service, the endpoint, the storage gateways, everything in tandem, that both the user and the administrator enforce those access rules. And, collaborators come in and they can access that guest collection without a local collection in the storage system. If you came in and accessed my guest collection on UChicago RCC Midway, I doubt any of you users have, any Globus users have Midway accounts except for just the local people. And even then, they don't have that ability to access my local file system. But I did that. I gave them that access with guest collections. One thing to note, any change in local permissions, that happens within a minute. So any revoking happens within a minute, and including this termination of run. So if you're downloading data, if you're transferring data off of my endpoint, and I terminate that access, that's going to go away within a minute, and you will no longer have access, and it'll kill the transfer. So talking a little bit about that access control delegation. You saw you can share it with individuals or you can share it with groups of individuals. So you can delegate access to ways. You saw me do it at the collection level. And I made Lev an access manager so he could control it at the collection level. You can also do it at the group level. I could have set up a group as a role to that collection. And so I could delegate management as the group and they could control who has access to that collection. And then, of course, I did it kind of by setting access to the group. And then Gigi, as my group manager, could allow people to be members of that group. And since that group have access, now they could then access my guest collection. So lots of different ways to control that. And, while some may think, well, that's a security risk having all of those different ways, I beg to differ. I think giving the users the types of access they need is actually a more secure way of allowing guest access to storage. So some data sharing configuration considerations, and it's all about the data. I highlighted data here, and it's all about the Globus. It's all files to us, right? We don't know what types of data is out there. We don't know that this is protected data. We don't know if it's got PHI in it. We don't know if it's got PII in it. It's all files to us. So you, as the administrator, you as the users, you need to kind of think about what data you're doing what with, and you need to create those policies. And once you create those policies, now you can use Globus to kind of fit within those policies and do those things that you want or don't want done with the data. So some of the things to consider as you're considering your both your data type and you're considering what you want done with the data is, any restrictions do you need to put on that data or the sharing permissions level? Like, do you want to, should it only be read-only sharing? Or maybe, as you saw, Lev in the configuration of Globus Connect server, read only for some paths and read write for the other paths. You as an administrator can control that. Any restrictions on which users may share. You can have you can say, well, all users can use Globus, but only these users that have actually had the data sharing training may actually use Globus to create guest collections. And again, as the administrator, you can do that. Any restrictions on paths shared with guests, with Lev's demo and what I said above, that's configurable as well. User sharing policies, who do you tie that down to? Can Alice share certain folders? Bob can share other folders, maybe his home directory. Really kind of reads to the point, speaks to the point above as well. And also, any restrictions you want to put on that identity domain of the guest coming in. As an administrator at the storage gateway level, you could do that. You could say, no, only sharing with, I don't want to share with Gmail identities because I don't know who those people are. Anybody can get a Gmail address, but maybe just with certain domains of institutions that you deal with or that's sharing with, so you can control that. So all these things to keep in mind. So what are some of the best practices? Again, it's all driven by policy and you come up with the policy and then you can use Globus to enforce those policies. But some of the best practices to that, when possible, create a guest collection one at a time and share many times. And you saw how I did that with my guest collection, right? I created a guest collection and then I shared it out to Lev and then so he could do some things. And then I shared it out with the group so they could do some things. I didn't create multiple guest collections. And that just allows you to, you're keeping track of fewer guest collections that way. Easier to manage the ACL list and the authentications than it is to manage multiple guest collections. Use groups to manage the people you share with. Again, a very easy method to manage that access. This is an obvious one, but don't share more data than necessary. People say, well, I'm setting up Globus Connect server, but I don't want all my data being accessible. Well, don't, right? It's like stores don't put all their inventory out in the store. They keep some in the warehouse. Don't share more data than you have to. Obviously, if the data you just read-only sharing, if you don't want people putting other files up there for other people to use because you don't know what's coming in, use read-only sharing. And share with, only share with institutional identities. I mentioned that in the last slide. And, maybe tie those domains down to institutions that you are working with or your researchers are working with. And of course, remove those sharing permissions when no longer needed. And that's, I'm speaking to the users out there that are setting up their own guest collections, but also the administrators. You can monitor that and you can revoke those. I'll say a couple things about sharing best practices and some of the policies. As a user, respect your administrators, right? They come up with these policies for a reason. Respect that. Don't try and work around it. Work within the framework they give you. Communicate with them. Let them know what you need and how you think it should be done. They're generally more than happy to work with you. And as an administrator, I'll say, don't be too restrictive. And the reason I say don't be too restrictive, because as soon as you put up those roadblocks, and it's very easy to say no to everything, but as soon as you do, remember you're dealing with tech-savvy people, and they're going to find a way around you. And when they find a way around you, that's when bad things happen. So, work with your users as well. Don't just be a naysayer. So, from an administrative standpoint, what are some of the sharing guardrails you can set up? Endpoints administrators can set boundaries and monitor sharing, right? You can monitor, we talked about that. There was a question in the chat, right? You can look at the guest collections that are out there. You can delete those guest collections. You can alter the administration or the permissions as an administrator. You may not be able to actually access the guest collection because, even if you're an administrator, You may not have the rights to see the data underneath there, but you can manipulate some of the permissions and disable collections as well. You, as an administrator, can disable right sharing if you want. Certainly something you saw Lev talk to that, his tutorial. You can restrict what data can be shared by location base, right? Determine what directories can and can't be shared. And of course, who can share. I've talked about this throughout this presentation. We saw Lev do it as well. And who can share what data, right? The above two bullet points can kind of be combined so you can really do that dynamically and share with various combinations of the above two. Restrict the identity domains of the collaborators. I've said that in the last two slides. You can tie that down. And of course, don't allow anonymous or what I just did, the all Globus users sharing of sensitive data. Of course, our slides aren't sensitive. You saw them here, but any sensitive data, make sure there's no sharing of that type going on. Okay, so policy drives practices at every level, and I say that from the administrator standpoint, and I say that from the user standpoint. Again, users respect your administrators. Administrators come up with fair policies and practices. Give your users what they need. Okay, so stepping back into our friendly FAIR acronym, how do you enable findability with Globus? Well, the Globus search services. We've talked about lots of services that Globus have. We've seen our transfer service. We've talked about other services out there. We've got a search service as well. And it's a service that allows users to adjust metadata for later discovery. It's backed by AWS Elasticsearch. And unlike the transfer service where we don't store any of that data, right? It's a bring your own storage model. We actually store your search indices. We store your metadata. And we give you an API for both access to that, to be able to look at that and present it, as well as authentication. Globus Auth, that is the foundation for everything we do. You can control visibility of that metadata based on Globus identities and groups, just like you can with everything we do in Globus. And distinct policies can be applied to both the data and the metadata. Obviously, with data and data sharing, you've seen in our last two presentations how you can set that. Same is true for the metadata. You can have different permissions for that, and how users can view those data elements, and what users can see those data elements. So, as I said, it's a our data search service gives you metadata store with fine-grained visibility controls. It's schema agnostic, which is kind of cool because there's a lot of search indices out there, search services out there where stuck to a certain schema. And there's very simple search parameters using URL queries, right? It's a REST-based service. And then there's complex search ability. So using the API, you can go in and you can do things like faceted search, and I'll actually do a demo of that on one of our portals. And speaking of portals, so what does search look like for an end user? And this is a portal that was developed by, we've got a portal framework out there, the Modern Research Data Portal design pattern. Certainly go and reference that, but it allows for Google-like text searching, right? Simple searches. It allows for faceted searching. This is like the Amazon, right? When you go and select certain products and then you can narrow it down maybe by these retailers, and it searches down and presents different data to you. And then, you could use that to do things like dynamically updating charts for amount of data out there as those facets change. So it really gives you, it's very, very high powered, gives you a lot of usability and configurability. And reusability powered by Globus. A couple of things I'm going to speak to here is automated data curation, right? I think reusability is a data curation story. And workflows from acquisition to publication. Is there a tool for that? I present a tool for that. Allow integration to any existing or planned applications, and that includes portals. Somebody might have an existing portal, so make sure that you're presenting something that they can use in their portals, and also give a nice portal framework. And I just showed that before, and I'll dig into what Globus has and some of the tools we have for portal frameworks to build your science gateways and facilitate discovery. So what's the holy grail for automation? And that's the build those automations from data inception to publication. And we've got that with Globus Flows. So Globus Flows is yet another service. It's an automation service where a user defines a flow and the required steps for that, and maybe some input schema. So the flow can be run different ways. And then the flow is run by a user, or it could be triggered on a certain event. And then Globus manages that. They manage the tasks and orchestrates that task from start to finish. So it brings manageable, reliable task orchestration, a nice event-driven execution model. It's a state machine based on the AWS state machine, and very state machines are a pretty basic programming model, right? We probably all state machines might have been the first thing we all learned when we started coding. Globus automations will span all resources. With Globus collections, it's visible by users universally, visible by machines universally. It doesn't matter what type of collection that is, what type of storage is backing it, just a Globus collection. So all your resources are there and accessible. Nice declarative language for flow definition and input schema. Globus Flows happens to use JSON. I'm not going to dig too much into that. I give references at the end if you want to look into Globus Flows a bit more. And certainly extensible, right? I mean, we provide what we call action providers in there that do certain things in a flow, but what if there's an action that you want that's not there? We've got a nice API. You can write your own action providers as well. So a way to really make that automation universal. And just kind of speaking about Globus Flows, it's a managed secure service for reliable task orchestration, supports those heterogeneous resources, right? All those Globus collections that might be different storage types. It's got that extensible and authorable event-driven execution model. Define your flow in JSON, input scheme in JSON, deploy the flow to a library. There it can be discovered by others. You're basically publishing it to the flows library where you could go in and others can see it. You can allow others to run it. You can allow others to modify it. You can create runs and allow others to see runs, just like you could with it's delegating roles, right? Like we did with the collections. And of course, it's extensible. I said you can create your own actions. So what does Globus Flows look like tied all together in a pretty common use case that we see and from data inception to publication? Well, with an instrument use case, you're going to transfer those files off the instrument. That's important because instruments are user facilities, so you got to get that data off that local storage somewhere else very quickly. And when it needs to be done, and Globus Flows can be triggered to do that. And you might want to send it up to some sort of intermediate store where you do some analysis on it. And let's say that analysis is something where you want to extract an image centroid. But it's not always the machine, right? You gotta be able to integrate humans into the loop, and we've got a mechanism for doing that. You can call a web form, and humans can come in and they might have to select a centroid of an image. They might have to classify the data. They might add some metadata, but humans can always be in the loop as well. Or you could send that into another compute step where you extract additional metadata, and then you ingest that into the search index. And now you've got that data and you're going to transfer it up to your end share where others can come and discover it and use that data. And you can satisfy all your grant requirements as well, all your data sharing grant requirements. So I showed you data portals and what that kind of looks like. And so from a user's perspective, right, data sent up there, how does the user discover that data? Well, portals are a great way to do that. And I'll demonstrate some of the portals that we have. One of the portals that we have out there where a user can kind of search and do the faceted search and see what data is out there. And then it's going to call out to Globus, and it's going to call out to our transfer service when you select that data, and then it'll give you the opportunity to select an endpoint of your own, and you can transfer the data to a collection of your own. So at Globus, we not only give the search, but we give you a way to get that data as well. And the example portal I'll show is the ALCF Community Data Co-op here. There's a lot of data here that's private, and this is something you can browse right now. You can go to acdc.alcf.anl.gov, And one of my favorite portals here is this materials data facility. And you can go in and search some of the data there. And this is publicly available data. And so let's say, I don't know, I was interested, and you'll see the search results over here. I'm interested in polymer data. So I click on that, and now it facets down to only the data that's polymer data. And let's say I only wanted data that was published in 2021, and there were only two of those. And so here we go. So it facets that down to, and there's a search result. So that's the data I'm interested in. And oh, this is the data I want. I want that. So I'm going to click on Globus, and it's going to take me out to the Globus web app. Here's the data published on that ALCF collection. And now I can select a collection of my own, and I could download the data set, and I could move that, let's say, to my, obviously, send that over to Midway and do a transfer there, and away we go. So I'm going to transfer that data up to Midway, and then I can reproduce that research and do whatever I want with that data. Okay. Oops, sorry. So you ask, is this out there in the wild? Have other people done this? You've seen it in the ALCF and the materials data facility. But yeah, so we've got a nice portal design framework out there. It's based on the modern research data portal framework. I highly encourage you to go out there and take a look at that. But I also am going to put a shout out to our professional services team. They are the experts at data portal creation. So if this is something you're interested in, ping our support staff, say, hey, I'd like to be put in touch with the PS team to design a data portal for me. And indeed, others have done this. There are data portals out there for everything from genomes to environmental data to weather data, the materials data that we saw at the materials data facility. Okay, so I've thrown a lot at you here, and I hope that your one takeaway is with Globus and all the services we have out there with our trade data transfer, data sharing. I've showed you some automation services, publication and discovery, the ability to do with our software as a service, with our interface, our nice web-based portal, very easy to work with your data. Our platform as a service, I mentioned our API set that's exposed. You can write your own code to use Globus, all of our services, do things in ways that you want to do, or that you want to interact with the service. And the unified data access. It doesn't matter what type of storage is out there. It looks like one thing. We make it easy for you. It's a Globus collection. So, Globus, it's your platform for enabling findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability to make your data fair. And as is my custom, I end with some resources, and I invite you to take a look at those things and investigate a little bit further and contact us with any questions.
That's great, Greg. Thank you so much. And I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. One just came in. Can you please re-mention the guest collection where the presentation can be downloaded? And we will be also sending out the video.
Sure. So here it is. Oh, hang on. Collections. Oh, here we go. Shareable by me. I'm going to look for my share. Here's my Greg's GW 2024 slide share. That's what you want to search for. And if you look here, I set permissions. The GW 2024 directory is readable by all users. So that should be set up there.
And then there's a comment from Ken. GCP doesn't work with instrument PCs because they generally have really old OS and therefore not allowed internet access. So how do you transfer?
There's a few cases where we've seen that. There are some that literally go back to Windows XP days, which even in some of those cases, you may get an older version of Globus Connect Personal to work. We're not supporting that necessarily, but we do have cases where people have done that. So yeah, it usually depends on the Windows version that's running on that machine and what else has been done on that specific system. But by and large, certainly the more modern instruments over the last few years are all very well supported. But to the point about not having internet access, there's a couple of different ways that people are addressing that. The one is that the data gets pulled off the instrument machine to a local system via some other means, and then that other system, which hopefully would be a Linux system that is then running Globus Connect server, can then be accessible, controllable via Globus via the internet. And also important to note that a lot of people don't want their instrument data going over the public internet. And so what you can do is configure the data channel, so the connection over which the data moves between two collections. You can configure that to run over the private network. So a very common scenario we see is the data channel in some of these instrument situations is from the instrument core, from a collection and a system at the instrument core to a research computing center or some other campus, larger campus storage system, maybe some project store. And that data is actually over the internet, the intranet, the actual campus internal network. The only thing that's on the outside of that is the control channel, which is to allow Globus to manage that transfer. So we have many, many use cases like this. And if people have specific questions about how to enable instrument data egress and data management, we'd love to help you. We don't charge for consultings in these kinds of scenarios, so please do reach out and we will set up time to chat specifically about your use case.